Good morning, good afternoon officially to everyone here at ACC, the Austin School. My name is Robert Jensen. Okay, I was waiting for the incredible round of applause. One more time. No, just good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robert Jensen. A little more of the woo-woo. Let's try it one more time. Robert Jensen. Oh, Jesus. You people haven't learned how to suck up to professors well enough. Always pretend that the professor is interesting and smart. Rarely are both things true, but of course, the professors hold the grade over your head, so it's best to pretend. For those of you who are young, learn to lie early. It makes life much easier. I don't mean lie in the offensive way of actively telling people things that are untrue to advance your... I just mean the quiet lies we tell, especially in the face of people who have more power than we do. So, I am Robert Jensen. I, until this year, was a professor at the University of Texas at Austin in the School of Journalism. I happily retired on September 1st. And yes, I'm smiling. And someday, all of you will know. Someday, the U.S. economy will have hit such a low point that the idea of retirement will be a fantasy, and you will all work till the day you die. You will drop dead in some mindless, meaningless job where you're exploited even more than you've been exploited up to this point in your young lives. Now, nobody got indignant. Your reaction should have been, no, we are the youth of tomorrow's America today. We are the leaders of today, tomorrow, and we are going to fashion a better world. That's what you're supposed to say. You're not supposed to sit there and shake your head and say, yeah, God damn, it's going bad. Oh, well. Okay, what are we going to do here today? The title of this talk might have seemed a bit odd, yes? Does anybody remember the title of the talk? Yeah? Okay. Pornography and climate change. What in the world do those two things have in common, yes? It is not readily evident what those two things have in common. But we're going to, as they say, connect the dots. Come on in. We're just getting going here. The really exciting stuff is about to start. Come on down front. Don't sit in the back. All right. So this conversation comes under the heading of the relatedness of the seemingly unrelated. That's one of the great joys in life, finding the relatedness in the seemingly unrelated. That might not immediately strike you as a joyful activity, but trust me, the older you get, the more fun it is to connect all those dots. And to do that, I am going to speak rather autobiographically today, talk a bit about myself to explain what I think this connection is. And to do that, I brought visual aids, 2 books that I'm going to talk about. So, the story starts half my life ago. I am 60 years old, and when I was 30 years old in 1988, I went back to graduate school to get the training and credentials so I could be a professor, which I thought would be a pretty good gig, and guess what? It was. It's a very, very nice job. And so there I was in graduate school, and I was interested in issues around freedom of expression, the First Amendment, media law. How does the law treat what we're doing now? Speech and press. And one of the issues that was very prominent at that point was a relatively new approach to dealing with the question of pornography, sexually explicit material. Now, you have to try and transport yourself, those of you who are younger, 30 years ago, before you were born, before the internet, all of that. At that time, pornography existed and was widespread in the United States, but not quite as ubiquitous as it is today. Right? There were debates about the status of sexually explicit material. And for a long time, those debates went on between what you would traditionally conceive of as a conservative and a liberal position. The conservative position, which was typically rooted in a religious tradition, was anti-pornography, yes? Pornography was seen as a violation of sexual mores. The traditional liberal position was in defense of pornography, a claim that people, adults, should have the right to engage in the production, distribution, and consumption of sexually explicit material. Conservative, liberal, right versus left. Yes, that makes sense. But in the late 1970s and 1980s, there was a third approach to the question of pornography that emerged from a feminist position. Typically, it was called the radical feminist critique of pornography. And it said, listen, the conservative critique is off base because it's trying to impose old patriarchal, that is male-dominant, sexual mores. The liberal defense of pornography is wrong because it's trying to protect patriarchal or access to women. Right? And the feminist critique said we have to rethink the way we analyze this and focus not on either subjective claims about morality or about claims to the right to use and make pornography, but to talk about harm to women and children. That is, in the production of pornography and the use of pornography, what really happens in the real world. Right? How is this material made? How is it used? And what are the nature of the images being distributed? All right. So what was once a two-sided liberal versus conservative debate shifted into a three-sided radical feminist, liberal, and conservative debate. Now, fast forward. Who won that debate? You're in the world today. Who won? The liberals, the pornographers won, didn't they? Right? If I asked any of you to find and display a sexually explicit image, how long would it take you?
3 seconds.
3 seconds on any electronic device. Okay. So there is more pornography, more readily accessible today than ever before. The radical feminist critique of pornography, which I thought at the time I first encountered it, was the most compelling way to actually understand sexually explicit material, didn't win. That's why most of you, when I said radical feminist critique of pornography, looked somewhat confused, because most folks have never heard of it. So let's just talk briefly about what is the radical feminist critique of pornography. I already signaled that it was rooted in an analysis of real-world harms to women and children in the production, consumption of it, right? And a focus on the actual nature of the images, because the most common liberal defense of pornography when one critiques it is, well, it's just sex on film, yes? Right? And human beings are sexual beings, yes? Everybody is a sexual being, whether you're celibate or sexually active, whether you're gay or straight. We are sexual beings. So the liberal defense is, what's the big deal? It's just sex on film. But what the radical feminist critique helped us understand, it was not just sex on film. Through the work primarily and originally of really one woman named Andrea Dworkin, one of the books I have is a recent edition of some of Andrea's most important work. It was just published this year. I'm going to tell you the title, although I'll be somewhat embarrassed telling you the title. Last Days at Hot Slit. That's kind of uncomfortable. There's a long story behind the title. But this collects some of the most important writing of Andrea Dworkin. Right? And Andrea was the one who really helped us understand that pornography was not just sex on film. Pornography was sex in the context of male domination and female subordination. That if you actually look at the images produced by the pornography industry, what you will see is a pattern. You will see a pattern of sexuality being presented in the context of male domination and female subordination. Right? In other words, Andrea helped us understand that pornography doesn't just present what one might call normal sex, sex that lives in the culture. Right? It presents a certain view of sex. It presents a view of sex that is rooted in men's domination of women, which is why, if you know anything about the contemporary pornography industry and the images it produces, you know that much of that material available today is in fact not just quote unquote straight sex, normal sex. It's sex rooted in men's control of and degradation of women. It is without a doubt the case that pornography is the most cruel and degrading form of media you can find in the world today. There's nothing quite like it. The core domination-subordination dynamic is men over women, male over female. But one of the interesting things about pornography, which Andrea's analysis helped us understand, was that pornography not only sexualizes male over female, it sexualizes every power dynamic that exists in the world. That is why pornography is not only the most deeply misogynist media available today, it's also the most racist. Because just as there is in patriarchy male domination and female subordination, in a white supremacist society like the United States, there is white over non-white, yes? So if you go to pornography, you will not only see men's subordination of women sexualized, you'll see racism sexualized in some of the most brutal ways that you can imagine. Right? All right. Now, I'm not saying misogyny and racism don't exist in the culture at large. I'm not saying they don't exist in other media. I'm saying that if you go to pornography, you will not simply see sex on film. You will see sex in that domination-subordination dynamic. Again, as Andrea pointed out, domination and subordination eroticized, made sexual. Right? Now, Andrea first started analyzing this material in the late 1970s. Now, most of you weren't around then, but you can probably imagine that the material she was analyzing was, by contemporary standards, quite tame. It was nothing like what you will see on the internet today. The intensity and depth of that misogyny and racism are far deeper today than when Andrea was originally looking and analyzing. Right? So, in a way, the last 40 years of U.S. history have demonstrated that Andrea Dworkin's analysis of pornography was accurate. In a sense, Andrea predicted what would happen in the world, and that is exactly what has happened. Right? This produces what I would call the paradox of pornography. Right? The paradox, simply put, is this. In a civilized society, how can you have a media genre like pornography that becomes more common, more readily accessible, right, in the same time period that that media becomes more deeply racist and misogynist? You see the paradox. You would think in a civilized society that as a media genre grew and became more common, it would become less racist and sexist. But in fact, in pornography, it's just the opposite. The paradox is the massive expansion of pornography has come in the same time period that the misogyny and racism has intensified. That's a paradox, yes? Like most paradoxes, it can be resolved by thinking about some of the assumptions. You might have noticed I introduced that paradox by saying in a civilized society, yes? That was kind of a joke. See, in other words, what I'm suggesting is that this analysis might cause us to reflect on the question, how civilized are we? Right? Now, certainly in the last 50 years, as a result of movements, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, all sorts of social movements that challenged some of the ugliest parts of this society, we have made progress, yes? I don't think anybody would doubt that. Right? Some of you who are in the room today accessing public education might not have been able to do that 50 years ago. So there are many ways in which this is a more civilized society today than it was 50 years ago, but the feminist critique of pornography asks us to ponder the ways in which we might have lost ground, the ways we may not be as civilized as we thought. That's in very short order a description of the radical feminist critique of pornography, the way I was trained going back 30 years ago to reflect on some of the taken for grantedness of the culture, because at this point pornography is taken for granted by most folks, yes? It's not seen as anything unusual. To demonstrate that, I would like all the men in the room to come up and tell us about the most recent pornographic images you saw. So who wants to go first? Okay, just kidding, just a joke. My point is, though, that if we were to do that in any room with a mixed group like this, there would be some uncomfortable moments. And even though pornography's the target audience is primarily men in this way, even women in the room would have experiences of seeing sexually explicit material. What the radical feminist critique simply asks us to do is reflect on what we take for granted. Right? And as I said, the key insight is that what we take for granted is not in some sense what we might imagine we want from the world, but a world that's defined by this domination-subordination dynamic. And when you think about the sex-gender system of patriarchy, and patriarchy is simply a term that means institutionalized male dominance, a society in which men don't hold all of the power and don't have all of the control, but disproportionately hold power and control outcomes. Right? And I'm sure we could survey the women in the room and get no shortage of examples of how that has played out in your own lives. But in this patriarchal society, there is a domination-subordination dynamic that structures not only pornography, but relationships more generally. So let's stay on that domination-subordination dynamic for a moment. When I was 30 years old, back when I started graduate school, I had never really thought about that question. Yes, I understood the world wasn't always fair, but the idea that there were systems in place that replicated this domination-subordination dynamic, that justified it, that allowed it to continue, was a rather new idea to me. You might say, well, you must have been a pretty dumb 30-year-old guy if you hadn't thought about that by then, but what can I say? Right? I was a 30-year-old white guy, and you know, one of the great things about being a white guy is you can stay stupid for a long time, and there's really no penalty for it. That was meant to be a joke. Also, you are what a comedian would call a tough room. You're a tough room to work here. You do not give up. Remember how I said it's good to learn to lie? I'm going to give you a little tip about success in the university. It's what I call the obligatory chuckle. Now, if a professor, someone like me, makes a really lame joke, yes? Now, you can sit there and stone-faced go and convey to the professor that you think that was not particularly funny. But remember, that professor holds power over your grade. So learn the obligatory chuckle. Now, you don't want to go too far, because then it looks like you're sucking up. So the obligatory chuckle is like this. I'll demonstrate. There, that's good. So next time, we're going to have a test. Next time I make a lame joke you don't think is funny, test out the obligatory chuckle, okay? I'm just trying to give you some life tips here. Okay. So all of a sudden, because I have been studying the radical feminist critique of pornography, I start to think, well, this domination-subordination dynamic is, of course, not limited to sexuality. It's not limited to gender. It's all over the culture. And so, for me, the first sort of insight into the nature of power really came from radical feminism. It might come from other sources for other people. Some people might first think about white supremacy and racism and say, oh, look at there's a domination-subordination dynamic in the racial system, and then you extrapolate beyond there. Wherever you start, if you take this kind of work seriously, it seems to me, eventually you look around and you see that this domination-subordination dynamic structures virtually all of human life. I'm not saying every moment in every relationship we are dominating each other or being subordinated, but it is a pattern. Right? So for me, it started thinking about the sex-gender system. Then I had to start thinking about race. Then I had to start thinking about economics, right? In a capitalist society, the idea that some people should accept their subordinated status while others capture an incredibly disproportionate share of the world's wealth, right? And then I started thinking about the world scene. Why was the United States the wealthiest country in the history of the world? What did that have to do with the fact it was also the most militarily powerful country in the history of the world? How is it that a domination-subordination dynamic plays out on the world stage in relationships between countries? Why is the global north so wealthy and the global south so impoverished? Right? That domination-subordination dynamic is woven through the fabric of all of the human systems that we now live with, right? Many of which we take for granted until we step back and analyze, right? So for me, this radical feminist critique of pornography opened up a whole new way of thinking about the world. And one by one, I sort of made my way through those systems, right? Patriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, and what we could call sort of first world imperialism, right? Those are all relationships, if you think about them, within the human family, yes? They're the way we structure relationships among people. But eventually, I started thinking about this domination-subordination dynamic, not only within the human family, but in the relationship between the human family and the larger living world. Because that domination-subordination dynamic is not only at play within our own societies, but it helps us understand the relationship of people to nature. Quick footnote. That's always kind of a strange claim to make, people and nature, because I think we're part of nature, yes? We are organic creatures. Yes. We're not separate from the ecosystems of the world.
Not in the slightest.
Yeah, not in the slightest, and exactly right. We are part of nature, but we make this separation between the human and the non-human, people and nature. And think about that relationship. Is that not also a domination-subordination dynamic? Because if you look around at the world, human beings, in the modern era especially, but not unique to this moment in history, do tend to look at what I call instead of nature, I tend to use this term, the larger living world, yes? The creaturely world out there. Is it not the case that we tend to look at that world as either a mine from which we extract what we need, energy, metals, whatever it is? We see it as either a mine from which we extract or a dump into which we throw our waste. In other words, the world is out there for us. We are in the dominant position. The world is naturally subordinated to us. It serves our needs. Okay? So I want to argue that the structuring dynamic between people and that larger living world is also one of domination and subordination, and has been for several thousand years now. So, let's pause. How's that working out for the larger living world? What is the current state of the ecosphere? How would we gauge the health of that larger living world? Well, it's an easy question to answer. Easy for a very disturbing reason, because any measure you want to look at that tells us something about the underlying health of the ecosystems on which our own lives depend, yes, back to that reality, we are organic creatures, right? We need a living world to survive. The health of the ecosystems on which our own lives depend is bad. It's getting worse, and it's getting worse faster than anyone anticipated. Any measure you want to look at about the health of that larger living world, you will find disturbing results. Yes? Now, the one that tends to be foregrounded most today is what is sometimes called global warming or climate change, or what I think is better described as rapid climate destabilization. Rapid climate destabilization. This domination-subordination dynamic between human and non-human is now at a point where the climate is not stable. And that is one of those places where the news is bad, it's getting worse, and it's getting worse faster than we anticipated. Right? Now, another parallel. I said that this domination-subordination dynamic that plays out in pornography has gone forward and the culture has largely turned away. How are we doing on climate change? More or less turning away. I want to suggest there are two kinds of climate change deniers in the world today. Okay? And if you're in one of these categories and you feel offended, I don't care. Deal with it. Two kinds of climate change deniers. The first tend to live in the Republican Party. Right? The climate change denial of the Republican Party says there is no such thing as climate change, or if there is, it's natural and humans don't have anything to do with it. And by the way, it's not going to make any difference anyway. We're all going to be fine. That's climate change denial. If you are a climate change denier, we can talk about that. But that rejection of the science behind climate change right now is typically a feature of the Republican Party, correct? Right? It's associated with a conservative political position. I'm not saying every Republican and every conservative is a climate change denier. Again, I'm talking about patterns, the way it tends to work out. That's the first category of climate change denier. The second category tends to be in the Democratic Party, and it goes something like this. Yes, climate change is real. Yes, it is human-generated. But we don't really have to do anything that different to deal with it. We'll just increase the amount of wind turbines and solar collectors we have. We don't have to think about the way we live. We'll just keep treating the world like a mine from which we extract and a dump into which we put our waste, but we're going to be a little more careful about it. I think that's a kind of climate change denial too. It doesn't deny the science, it denies the implications of the science. The implications of the science being that business as usual cannot continue. That this planet cannot continue to support 8 billion people living at anything like the level of consumption that the contemporary human societies consume. Right? That in fact, if we are going to deal meaningfully with climate change, yes, we're going to have to think about wind turbines and solar collectors and alternative energy sources so that we can eventually stop fossil fuel use. That's true. But that is not going to get us all the way home. We're going to have to start thinking about things that people don't want to think about, which are population. You might say, Jensen, your grammar's a little off. Population is a singular. It should be is population, but I want to say it's our plural population because we have to think about the number of people and we have to think about the number of things people have. The population of human beings and the populations of the gadgets that human beings use. And people can disagree, reasonable people can disagree, but I think if we really take this seriously, we're going to realize at some point there have to be fewer people with fewer things on this planet. Now, how does that go over in contemporary society? Imagine you're a politician. You want to win office. You want to win an election. Are you going to win that election if you stand up and say, people of this district, I can guarantee you that if you elect me, I will move quickly to initiate policies that will reduce your material lifestyle, that will make sure you have less. Right? Is that the winning campaign strategy these days? No.
Does it apply to everyone?
It would have to apply to everyone. Actually, it wouldn't apply equally because some people would have to give up much more. And some people would have to get more because of the current inequity in the system. But in the aggregate, there have to be fewer of us consuming less. Nobody knows how to get there. Right? Step back. I said I was interested in the relatedness of the seemingly unrelated. It's hard to imagine two subjects that seem more unrelated than sexually explicit material and climate change. What brings them together? I think what brings them together is the recognition that the underlying domination-subordination dynamic, right, has produced a world that is at odds with our stated moral beliefs. Let me say that one more time. The domination-subordination dynamic that is woven into the fabric of everyday life has created a world that is at odds with our stated moral beliefs. What are our stated moral beliefs? Well, there's about 40 of us in the room, and I don't pretend to imagine we all have the same exact moral system, but I bet I could get pretty much 100% agreement in the room on some principles, such as the dignity of all humans, that every human being born on this planet comes into the world with the same claim to dignity as every other human. Anybody want to argue with that? No, of course nobody's going to argue with that, because if you argued with that, you would be in a category typically known as an asshole. And nobody wants to say, yeah, I'm an asshole. Okay, so, I don't know, can I say asshole? They're recording it. Okay, I have permission, thank you. So, moral principles like the inherent dignity of all people, like the goal of solidarity. Human beings are social animals. We want to live in community. The recognition that it's hard to live in community without some reasonable level of equality so that you don't have massive disparities in wealth. Dignity, solidarity, equality, these are moral values that virtually everybody agrees to, whether you're more secular or more religious, whatever religious tradition you come from. Those are core human moral principles. Yet we live in a world in which the domination-subordination dynamic, woven into the fabric of everyday life, puts our societies at odds with our own stated moral principles. That's hard to deal with, especially when we have taken for granted some of the outcomes of that domination, subordination, especially when those outcomes are pleasurable. And let's face it, one of the reasons pornography is so widely available and accepted is because it provides pleasure. I'm not saying it's an uncomplicated kind of pleasure, and I'm not endorsing it. Obviously, I'm a critic. But we have to recognize it is a pleasure-producing media genre. And people often have a hard time giving up pleasure. Okay, I see your hand. Hold on one second. Let's think about the question of ecological degradation, climate change. Why is it so hard for us to all say, listen, we've got to change? Well, all of that fossil energy we're using, all of that material we're extracting, it produces things that we like, yes? It air conditions rooms in Texas so that we can comfortably sit in them while we're listening to boring professors give us lectures, right? Can you imagine how much harder it would be to sit through some of those boring lectures in an unair conditioned room in Austin, Texas in July? It'd be impossible. Okay. So the reality of all of that extraction and all of that energy is that it provides pleasures, and it's very hard for us to disconnect from and renounce those pleasures. So this relatedness of the seemingly unrelated, the domination and subordination dynamic that gives rise to some of the problems we identify, yet the recognition that some of the reasons we cannot easily and immediately simply correct that is the pleasure produced by these systems. Now the thing is, of course, that pleasure is not equally distributed across the board. Some people get a bigger share of it than others, and when we engage in this kind of economic activity, human beings take the lion's share of that pleasure, leaving the rest of the creaturely world to suffer. Right? And so, what has been my goal here? My goal has been to depress you, to make you miserable. My goal has been to create discomfort, right? Because it's very easy to go through life avoiding discomfort. But everybody knows that if you're not uncomfortable now and then, you don't tend to grow much, you don't tend to learn much. And I think there are a lot of methods in this culture by which we can easily avoid discomfort, yes? There are a lot of cheap diversions in this culture, right? There's a lot of cheap drugs, and I mean drugs in the widest sort of sense, yes? Caffeine, alcohol, illegal drugs. There's a lot of ways we can numb ourselves cheaply with pharmaceuticals. Cheap food is a way to numb ourselves, yes? If you're feeling bad, go to some restaurant and, sidle up to the all-you-can-eat buffet. And before you know it, you've forgotten about all your problems, right? Cheap pharmaceuticals, cheap food, cheap entertainment, spectacle entertainment, right? Very easy to just distract yourself. So in a culture where there is a lot of cheap diversion, right, I think we have to push ourselves into that discomfort. And that has been my goal today. Now, I said I had a couple of books to recommend, then we'll open it up to conversation. I mentioned that Andrea Dworkin's work has been anthologized. There's a new collection with a somewhat uncomfortable title again, Last Days at Hot Slit. It just came out, I think, within the last month. And it's great to see Andrea's work back in print, so I recommend that highly. On the ecological, I'm going to recommend another book that's a collection by another important thinker. It's called Nature as Measure, The Selected Essays of Wes Jackson. Wes is a leading figure in the sustainable agriculture movement, trying to understand how we can grow food in a way that doesn't destroy the earth. And this book is another place to kind of dig in and try to deepen one's understanding. Andrea is writing exclusively about the domination-subordination dynamic that's at play within the human family, primarily around the sex-gender question, but in other ways as well, because Andrea dedicated her life not only to a critique of patriarchy, but a critique of white supremacy and capitalism and imperialism. She was a radical across the board. Wes's subject in this book is more the domination-subordination dynamic between humans and the larger living world, although both, I think, are aware of the importance of the other. So I'll have those up front if people want to look at them after we're done here. But this is, again, my attempt to make you uncomfortable. So if I succeeded, you may want to get out as quickly as possible, but let's open it up to not only questions, I'm happy to answer questions, but comments, of course, and challenges, very important. If you think anything I said was off base, don't hesitate. Go ahead.
Succeeded in making me feel comfortable because I really need to use the restroom.
Okay, Ryan, you get a hall pass. Take off.
Thank you.
All right. So let's open it up. Again, it is not easy to jump into a conversation about the deep depravity of the modern pornographic world or the slide into chaos that is happening on the ecological level, but jump in anyway. Yeah. Can you be a little louder, please?
What do you think about
The New Green Deal. First of all, let's make sure everybody knows that phrase. The New Green Deal. I'm looking for nods or shaking of head. Okay, some people shook their heads. So the New Green Deal, I always get it, this is what happens when you get old. Word order becomes a problem. The Green New Deal. Right. No, you said it correctly. I messed up. The Green New Deal, of course, harkens back to the New Deal of the Great Depression, the Roosevelt administration, the attempt to fashion government policy to deal with economic collapse. In this case, that's a concern, the growing economic inequality, the evaporation of good jobs for large segments of the population, but with a green that is an ecological focus. In other words, taking seriously what a friend of mine used to call the multiple cascading ecological crises. I always love that phrase. The multiple cascading ecological crises. Some of you looked happy, so I thought I had to remind you of how bad things are. Multiple, meaning it's not just global warming, yes. There are multiple ecological crises. Cascading mean they're going to play out in ways we can't predict. the multiple cascading ecological crises require a Green New Deal. And some of the new, younger, progressive members of Congress have introduced a resolution which they hope will eventually take the form of more specific laws. What do I think about it? Well, if you pay attention to the debate around the Green New Deal, there's a conservative critique that says the Green New Deal is unrealistic, yes? Can't pass these, it won't work. Right? There's also, I think, an important critique that should come, in a sense, from the left that says the Green New Deal is a fine start, but it is not nearly ambitious enough. That the Green New Deal, which focuses on things such as alternative energy and responses to not only economic inequality but ecological crises, is good but inadequate. Because, as I pointed out, people have a hard time coming to terms with the fact that we are either going to find a way to have fewer people on this planet consuming less, or we're in for a heap of trouble. And the Green New Deal is still being discussed within pretty conventional political terms. The Green New Deal still promises, in some sense, bounty for all. Right? We just need more wind turbines, more solar collectors, and everything's going to be fine. And so while I think the Green New Deal is an important initiative and I support it, I think we also have to keep repeating, but it is not enough. That no combination of renewable energy sources is going to allow us to continue to live the way we do. And again, every time we say that, we have to recognize there's incredible inequality in people's access to energy and material. Right? That a relatively small group of people consumes a disproportionate share of all that energy and those resources. But in the aggregate, we are going to have to lower. And I don't think the Green New Deal really takes that on. Now, you can understand why it might not. It's hard enough to get, in this culture, people to think about economic equality and renewable energy. So my hope is that it's a success and immediately becomes outdated as we push even harder. Yes, ma'am.
So, kind of following that.
Yeah.
I feel like at the rate we're going,
Uh-huh.
I feel like if we don't start implementing these like the Green New Deal, like quickly and
Mm-hmm.
more often, it seems like it's just going to come to more of a drastic situation. And like as an individual, I often feel like how can I actually contribute when it's a lot of corporate companies who are dumping the most waste into the ocean and not being responsible with their materials, etc.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is it just a matter of like electing the people who can, create policies and things like that? I mean, because I can only, as an individual, and even us, people of Austin only do so much. I guess that kind of thought. What is it going to take?
Well, that question's kind of a downer. I don't want to answer that. So, if I understand you right, you are articulating what is probably on everybody's mind, which is, okay, I accept that, in fact, your account of reality is roughly accurate, but I am 18, 19, 20 years old. I'm trying to get through a semester at ACC. What the hell am I supposed to do about this? And is there anything that can be done anyway? Or are we screwed? Is that a reasonable summary? Okay. And it's a reasonable question. So I would step back and say a couple of things. One is that in response to the question, what's more important, individual action or committing all your time to trying to change politically the structure of society? The answer depends. Some people are better suited for some actions than others, yes? I always say, if you look at the human species, we all differ in our talents and temperaments. Some people are drawn to public engagement, trying to work on political campaigns. Other people tend to prefer to drop back and work in much smaller settings. Right? Whatever you find yourself drawn to, I would say, go that direction. But always asking yourself, what else should I be doing? Right? So the choices we make as individuals matter. The choices on how much we consume, for instance. But everybody knows that you choosing to consume less is not going to change the trajectory magically. Right? So that means you have to engage politically to try to change the structure as well. Right? But people who are gung-ho on engaging politically should also probably think about their individual choices too. So there's no easy answer to it. I look around, and some I know in the room have been working on, for instance, one place where there's been a lot of energy is to think about our food system. Right? Our food system is a disaster. It consumes massive amounts of fossil energy. It produces low-quality food. Right? It is both socially and ecologically a disaster. And I know folks, two of them sitting in my line of sight here, who have spent a lot of time thinking about that and working at the local level on that. Is that worth doing? Yes. Is that going to change the world overnight? No. Right? So you move in and out of things. And I think one has to do that recognizing that we're probably not going to win. Right? That you have to do that, and also do that with the awareness that the likelihood of success, if by success we mean the kind of dramatic change that will put us on a sustainable course, probably not going to happen. Right? Okay. But there's a lot of things in life that one commits to without guarantees of success, even when you think it isn't likely to succeed. I mean, in some sense, human beings do that every day. For instance, everyone in this room is going to die someday. Yes? Is there a way to prevent that? No, not unless you're, Elon Musk or one of those high-tech freaks who think they're going to invent a way to stay alive forever. All right, so you're all going to die. What's the point of getting up in the morning? You're going to die. You're going to die. You're a fool for getting up and pursuing an education.
It's better to live as long and as prosperous as you can, also to help create a lineage.
Yeah. So I would say it's more a question of what kind of life one wants to live. And the only thing I can say from experience is that if you take this seriously, it's kind of counterintuitive, but I think if you take this seriously and start building these kinds of questions into your life gets better. And I don't mean better necessarily materially, but it gets better in that it's easier to live a richer and more meaningful life if you engage this. That's been my experience. I don't want to generalize too much, but I think it is worth considering. Yeah?
Would you say it might be helpful if our society was a bit more pessimistic than the weird full amount of optimism we have?
Yeah, this question of optimism or pessimism, and sometimes people say, well, it's not optimism, you just have to be hopeful. I just think it's good to be realistic. We're trained to look at data, to analyze data, and come to rational conclusions about it. Okay, when I look at the state of the ecosphere, the rational conclusion I come to is roughly what I presented. Is that optimistic? No. Is it pessimistic? I don't know. Is it hopeful? I don't even, it's just the way it is, it seems to me, an accurate account of the world in which I live. And what I choose to do about that, right, might then engage me in a discussion of what it means to have hope or not. But I think we sometimes are pressured by the society to be optimistic, to be hopeful when we don't really feel it. Right? There's a kind of peer pressure. If you're sitting around with friends and you start to say, well, I'm starting to feel really down about this, and then, hey, dude, why don't you lighten up, chill. There's a lot of pressure to not articulate what we think and feel. And I don't see how that's going to be helpful. Yeah, in the back, man. And a little louder, please, so we can hear. Uh-huh. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Even though we have been recycling everything, even though we have been doing secondhand, even though we have been trying as hard as we could to completely not buy new fragrance
Mm-hmm.
ever possible. My family personally recycles, composts. My husband is a chef.
Yeah.
Tries right now to kind of break the whole cycle of food
Mm-hmm.
they talk about. So my question to you is, at which point do you personally justify severe governmental overreach? And an example of that for me would be, let's say, a government issue that says everybody has to drive electric cars from this day
Yeah.
forward. You cannot water your lawn more than once a week for 2 hours.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. At which point, let's say, environmentalists could be about 2 degrees up and we're doing forever. Do you agree that maybe governmental overreach is justified at 1 degree up?
Okay, so if you couldn't hear, the question is really, at some point, if we recognize how deep the hole we're in is, what level of, let's call it collective coercive activity, which means government, are we willing to accept? We pointed out that people have trouble limiting themselves, which is a way of saying organisms on this planet have trouble limiting themselves. Right? What do I mean by that? This isn't a function of just being human. It's a function of being a carbon-based organism. Right? One way, I'm going to digress, but I'll swing back. One way to think about the concept of life, right? What is it? What is life? What does it mean to be alive? It's actually a question that biologists struggle with. How do you identify something as living? Well, one way you can think about it is that life is the scramble for energy-rich carbon. Right? When we're pulling out all those fossil fuels, we're pulling out carbon, we're burning it, we're doing all this. Life is about seeking carbon. Carbon's what gives us all those pleasures. Yes? All right. Every organism does that. Right? And organisms sometimes do that to their own detriment. Right? Usually, natural processes kick in which limit it. If you have too many deer in an area and they strip the area of food, what happens to the deer population? It goes. Deer don't get around the campfire and say, you know, we deer have been eating too much, therefore we have to limit ours. No other organism has ever had to do what human beings are going to have to do, which is impose limits on ourselves. No other organism has ever had to do that. And it goes against our nature in a sense. Okay? Hold on one second. How are we going to do that? Well, if we try to do it individually, we, I think, have a pretty good record of recognizing that ain't going to work, which means we're going to talk about collective action. And collective action is done through government. Now, the problem with talking about this is in the United States today, government has been so demonized that any collective action is seen as somehow, you know, tyranny. But government, remember, is just people getting together to act collectively. And at some point, to borrow a famous phrase from the history of ecology, we are going to have to engage in mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. We're going to have to coerce each other into limiting ourselves. And we're going to have to do it through mutual agreement. But it's going to be coercion. It's going to be all of us saying, you can't have any more than her or me, and we're going to have to keep an eye on each other because people are going to be tempted to get a little more. Not because we're some, you know, greedy, just it's the nature of a carbon-based animal. Okay. So is that government overreach? I don't know. You can imagine a dystopic future where a fascistic government imposes limits on people, keeping a good share for its leaders. Right? You can also imagine, and there are examples of it in human history, of people coming together collectively by choice to engage in mutual coercion. Right? The existing system doesn't seem very promising for this, but that's one of those questions. How are we going to invent new ways of organizing ourselves so that that mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, can actually work? I don't have a blueprint for it. Nobody else does. But I think at some point we're going to have to come to terms with that. Somebody wanted to get in. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 So I heard two questions in that. One is, how does one effectively engage with someone who denies the science behind climate change? And number two, how do we engage to think about a more collective sensibility rather than a more individualistic sensibility? So let's take those two separately. If you are seriously concerned about rapid climate destabilization, global warming and climate change, I'm sure you've had discussions with people that infuriated you, frustrated you because you couldn't find a way to connect. Right? And I've had those too. And the first thing is to recognize that the reason people hold on to climate denial is rarely rational. It's not because they evaluated the science and reject it. It's because the consequences of accepting the science are distasteful to them. Yes? And you pointed out, one, if you are a dyed-in-the-wool, hardcore libertarian capitalist, climate change is a very disturbing reality because it means that mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, is going to put your capitalist ideology to rest for good. Right? So it's not a wholly rational engagement, but that's not news. You're aware of this, yes? Human beings are not fully rational all the time. Looking around, yes? And that means you're not rational all the time, nor are you, nor are any, even I. Okay, especially I am not rational. Okay, so we know that rationality is not driving the bus, right? We're a weird product of all of this emotion and passion and non-rational component. But we try, that's why we come to college, right? We try to enhance our capacity for evaluating evidence and coming to logical conclusions. And so we do want to engage. The only thing I've ever said to climate change deniers that I think sometimes gives them pause is to ask a simple question. And we'll just run through it here. How many of you are climate scientists? How many of you are trained in climate science and do original research on the question of climate change? Anybody? No, I didn't think so. Neither am I. How many of you are trained scientists in a way that give you the capacity to read and evaluate climate research with a fairly high level of confidence? That is, you're trained in some scientific endeavor that means you can read original research in climate and evaluate it. Anybody? No, not me. Okay. In other words, no one in this room is competent to evaluate the question of climate change individually. Agreed? Okay. So why do I believe that climate change is real, it's human-generated, and it's a threat? It's because of the peer review process in modern science, which is not perfect, but has been remarkably successful at helping us understand the way the world works. You know, we're sitting in a room that's the product of that. You know, electricity, lights, you know, good digital technology. That came from science. It came from a peer review process where people who have training evaluate each other's work. Again, it's not perfect. If you've ever done research, you know how ugly the process can be. But in general, it's fairly good at coming to a consensus in science. And the consensus in climate science now is essentially universal. There are a few people who are trained as scientists who reject it, but it's trivial. Right? So we believe in climate science if we do, because we accept the results of the scientific method and the peer review process by which scientists check each other. Okay? Now, if somebody denies the climate science, a reasonable question is, what other part of modern science do you reject that you're incapable of? In other words, is there any other part? Do you say about computers, I don't believe computers really work? Do you reject computer science? Right? When somebody opens up and shows you a laptop, you say, well, that's just not real. No, there is no other conclusion that is at the level of the consensus in climate science that's routinely rejected in this culture with one exception. What is it? Pardon? Vaccinations to some degree. I was thinking of another one with an even longer history, but you're right about that. What other aspect of science where there is a nearly complete consensus is routinely rejected? Evolution by natural selection. What motivates people who reject evolution by natural selection?
Religion?
Yeah, whatever your view on it, virtually everybody who rejects evolution by natural selection does so out of religious motivations, which are, by definition, not scientific. Right? In other words, you cannot win an argument with a climate denier overnight. The best you can do, I think, is to ask a simple question. Where else in the world do you reject science on the basis of no independent knowledge of your own? It doesn't mean we have to accept everything scientists say. I don't accept everything scientists say about how the world should work. Right? When we talk about policy and how the world should move forward, I can argue with scientists forever. But on the science itself, when I lack the capacity to make an independent judgment, and there is a consensus among qualified scientists through the peer review process, I accept it. I don't know what else to say. On the other one, about how to argue about an individual or collective mentality, what I usually try to remind people is, people say that greed is natural, yes? And human beings are greedy and people are individualistic, and that's just human nature, correct? You hear that argument? Okay. Well, let's evaluate it. Is it true? Are people greedy?
Yes.
Has anybody in the room ever acted in a greedy fashion? Oh, come on. If you're not raising your hand, you're either just one of those people who refuses to raise their hand. If you're one of those people who refuses to raise your hand in class in response to a professor's question, raise your hand. Okay. That would have been a time for an obligatory chuckle, by the way. Okay. It is true. Human beings are greedy and self-interested, yes? All right, let's ask another question. Has anybody in the room ever done anything to benefit another person when it had no benefit for you and might have even involved risk for you? Has anybody ever done anything nice for somebody? Is that part of human nature? Yes, of course it is. So to say that greed and individualism is human nature and therefore we can't do anything about it is ridiculous. Of course it's part of human nature, as is all these other activities. The question is really what's at the core of our nature. And there you would want to look not just at today, you'd want to look at all of human evolutionary history, yes? You wouldn't want to just say how are people today, because if you generalize from today, well then you're taking this one snapshot of one moment out of 200,000 years of human history. Because human beings, Homo sapiens, have been on the planet for about 200,000 years. And here's the obvious point. For virtually all of our evolutionary history, human beings were a cooperative, not a competitive species. Right? You go back into human history, especially the vast majority of human history before agriculture, when we lived as what anthropologists would call band level, 15 to 50 people in a band, hunting and gathering. Did those people engage in individual competition to maximize their own self-interest? No. If you tried to do that, you would be dead very quickly. Human beings are by nature, if we're by nature anything, cooperative and collaborative. That's why we are the dominant species on the planet, because we got really good at being cooperative and collaborative to dominate the rest of the living world. So the idea that, people are just too individualistic, it's true enough in some trivial sense. It just doesn't capture the full breadth of being human. And I'd like to be human in as broad a way as I can. I don't want to just be human in the way that contemporary advertising tells me to be human, which is to say, I don't care about you, I just want more stuff, which is really the message of contemporary advertising, which means it's the message of the contemporary economy, which means it's the message of the contemporary world dominated by that economy. Hey, you over there, shut up, I don't care about you. I just want more stuff. Right? Does anybody want to live that way? Even people who claim to be dyed-in-the-wool capitalists don't want to live that way. That was an extraordinarily long response to a very pointed question, and I will try to avoid doing that again. Yes? How do I feel about nuclear energy? I don't like it. And that's an interesting question, because among people who might call themselves environmentalists, there is a difference of opinion these days. So if you go back to the origins of nuclear power and the eventual resistance to it, if you were in that camp environmentalist, you were almost certainly anti-nuke, yes? Not only anti-nuclear weapons, but anti-nuclear power. Why? Well, for two basic reasons. One is the risk of an accident, right? And those risks are real, and we've seen them. The two most frightening ones were Fukushima in Japan recently, and before that, Chernobyl in the former Soviet Union, where literally hundreds of square miles of Russian territory are still off limits to human beings because they are so contaminated. There was also the 3 Mile Island accident in the U.S., which was not at the same level but still disturbing. So the risk of accidents, which led most environmentalists to be anti-nuclear, still exists. The other problem, of course, is the storage. We still have no safe disposal method for the waste created by nuclear power plants, right? And that has not been resolved, and I have no reason to think it will be resolved, at least not in my lifetime. Now, when I was in college, to be an environmentalist meant to be anti-nuke. Today you can't make that assumption because some wing of the environmental movement has said essentially, we recognize the risk, we recognize the problem of storage, but the threat from burning fossil fuels is so great that we must generate electricity from other sources. That means wind and solar, but wind and solar are not enough to power the modern world. This gets to the point I made earlier, which is I'm anti-nuke because I think there is still no good argument for it, but I recognize that in making that, you are committing yourself to fewer people consuming less. And that's what this culture really can't come to terms with still. Even environmentalists, even the Green New Deal people can't come to terms with saying in public, we need to think about the end of economic growth, the reduction of the human population, and a dramatic decrease in the consumption by human beings of energy and other materials. And you can see why people don't want to go there, right? It's not a winning argument in today's political climate. So I reject the move toward accepting nuclear power as a necessary component, but I don't want to be all high and mighty about it. I see why people argue for it. I am not an expert in nuclear power, but that's one place where I actually have some close friends who are, and they are all anti-nuke. Really smart people who look at the science, do the science, and they are dead set against it for those reasons. Yeah. Yes?
I have a quick question. What do you think of the idea of taking the Earth's trash and waste and launching it into space?
Space, the final frontier. I think in general, every time people say there is a solution to our problems on this planet in space, you should laugh, you should chuckle at those people because they are deluded. Right? The most interesting one is, I think, the current fascination with colonizing Mars. Yes? I have a friend who teaches physics in San Antonio, and he said one of the most, he's only in his second year teaching, and he said one of the most disturbing, because he's a physicist, he's really into physics. He likes physics. Right? I don't, only because I don't understand it. I wish I were smart enough to. And he said one of the most depressing things is many of the physics students who he wants to like are fascinated with colonizing Mars. We're going to solve all our problems by going to Mars, which is lunacy. I mean, it's not evidence of mental illness. I don't mean it literally, but it's crazy. Nobody can seriously think that we are going to colonize another planet. Okay. What it is a diversion from dealing with reality here. Right? We're not going to find our answers in space. In fact, I think the resources devoted to the space program are one of the greatest boondoggles in my lifetime in the United States. I would immediately defund space travel. It's a loser. Right? It keeps us diverted in the wrong way. I think the work, the science that many people currently who are employed by NASA do is very important. But as far as space travel and all that, it's time to say this is the planet we live on. We either make it here or we don't. The rest is fantasy.
So what we're saying is that even if we use space as a way to dispose of trash, it still wouldn't work.
How do you, well, first of all, in case...
Have you ever been to the landfill?
No.
Yeah.
Because it's very informative.
Yeah.
There's a lot of trash there.
Yeah.
There's
So,
a line of dump trucks that goes about a mile long every
Yeah.
single day waiting
Yeah.
to dump trash.
yeah.
It's unbelievably impossible to imagine how all that trash will get into a vehicle
Yeah.
to take it somewhere else.
There's
We can barely even put it over there.
There's no feasible way to do it. Not to mention the fact you shot all that stuff in space, it would knock down every satellite up there, and then you would have no GPS, and you wouldn't be able to get home. Right? But, your mention of the reality of trash and how kind of out of sight and out of mind it is for those of us who live in certain sectors. It's one of those things that the reality of trash is one of the many frightening things. We have outstripped our capacity to deal with that waste. In many places, it's being burned, dramatically increasing the problem of air quality. If you go to major cities in South Asia, places like New Delhi, Mumbai, Lahore, I just read a report that 16 of the 20 worst air quality measures are cities in South Asia. And one of the things that contributes to it is the overwhelming amount of trash leads to burning. Right? We don't know what to do with that. And to date, we've been able to kind of avoid the consequences of it. But that can't go on forever. Recycling is a sensible thing to do, but it's not going to solve the problem. Yeah. I'm just looking if somebody else hasn't talked yet. Go ahead. Oh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So would it help if more production were local? Well, yeah, in some sense, by definition, it would. It lowers transportation costs. It makes you more aware of what you're using where you are so that there's a chance of increased sense of responsibility. I'm not saying there's no place for trade in the world, right? There are some goods that you can't get locally. But I think this is where the food movement has made the point that if the question is only, how can I make sure I have fresh fruit on the shelves 12 months a year, even when those fruits don't grow where I live, we're going to have a problem, right? That we have to think about seasonal and local and transportation and supply chains, especially because when the primary production of so many of our goods, like this thing in my pocket, right, is out of sight, out of mind, I don't tend to think about the environmental degradation that it took to create this or the environmental effects of when it is disposed of. I don't tend to think of it. And so there's lots of reasons to think about that. But again, even if all production was local, we still have to think about less. Right? We still have to think about what it means to live with less. Yeah. You're going to have to be a bit louder, too.
Is it true that the food industry is one of the most contaminated?
The food industry is one of the most contaminated? Oh, well, so the modern system of producing food, what's typically called industrial agriculture, which is remarkably fossil fuel dependent. It's dependent on fossil fuel not only for the machinery that produces, the traction on the farm, tractors and all that, but the inputs that are used in modern industrial farming, the herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, the fertilizers are all fossil fuel based, right? And, there's always a joke modern agriculture is really converting oil into food. You know, when you eat a potato, you're eating oil in a sense. All right. So what that means is that agriculture is a major driver of global warming. I've seen statistics that suggest that it's number 2 behind power generation, that its contribution to global warming is extensive. Now, on the other environmental effects of agriculture, that's where the news is bad and getting worse also, because there's soil erosion, because the way we farm, not only today but for some time, depending on the kind of farming, erodes soil, and you can't grow food without soil, and we are eroding soil at rates well beyond replacement levels. There's a problem of soil contamination, right, that all of these inputs are contaminating the soil. There's the problem of runoff of those contaminants, that they don't just stay in the dirt there. When that soil erodes, they go into the, you know, in the United States, you know, much of it, all those corn and soybeans farms in Iowa that get drenched with fertilizer, herbicides, pesticides, where does that end up? In the Gulf of Mexico. Drains in the watershed into the Mississippi River, into the Gulf, and so you have a dead zone in the Gulf where basically nothing can live. That's a direct result of corn and soybean farms in the American Midwest. Right? That the nature of agriculture's contribution to environmental degradation is extensive. Yes.
Do you think it's supposed to, like, a lot of people started going vegan, like,
So vegan and vegetarian questions are interesting. I've been a vegetarian for the past 35 years, and I support meat eating, okay, which sounds a little strange. I don't want to eat meat myself for all sorts of reasons, but I do not think there is and I'm going to use a term you hear a lot, a sustainable agriculture without livestock. Right? Wes Jackson, the guy I talked about, used to always say, if you look at how nature farms, and of course nature doesn't farm, but if you look at natural ecosystems, he said they almost always include livestock, right? There's a mix of plants and animals. Right? I don't think there really is a viable, sustainable agriculture without some livestock, without some meat. And the reason is quite simple, because livestock not only produce the meat we eat, they produce they defecate and urinate, which is a source of fertility. Right? So small farms that have integrated cropping and livestock, right, that aren't dependent on fossil fuel and all those inputs, recycle manure, for instance, as fertilizer. And the easiest way to make a viable small farming operation is with mixed cropping and livestock. And I think that's the future. And I also think that, let's face it, human beings were omnivores. We evolved to eat meat. And to magically say, listen, all you billions of people, stop doing what you evolved to do. I mean, I did it. Lots of people do it. I just don't think it's a reasonable project. So I have friends who are vegan. I'm vegetarian. And I have no problem with people eating meat. I think if you're eating meat that's purchased from a supermarket, or if you're eating meat at a fast food restaurant, there's a better way. Just put a gun to your head and pull the trigger. Because if you're eating that crap, heaven help you. Right? The industrial produced meat is very, very dangerous for all sorts of reasons. It's dangerous to the health of the animals while they're alive. It's dangerous to the health of ecosystems. It's dangerous to human health. I think we're going to have to produce meat differently, but I don't think the future is vegan. I don't think it's realistic, and I don't see the point of haranguing people to behave like I do when it's not realistic. So it's interesting. I just realized that the entire discussion, so I introduced 2 topics, the feminist critique of pornography and the ecological critique. In some sense, the ecological critique is much more frightening, yes? But you all were like, yeah, let's talk about the end of the world. That's fine. Just don't make me talk about porn. Do not make me talk about the intimate realities of living in a pornography-saturated world. I'm just noting that. I'm not suggesting we have to talk about it, but it's interesting that it's difficult to talk about, and in some ways, easier to talk about, fire and brimstone end of the world stuff.
Probably because pornography is a much more personal thing that people do in their life.
Yeah, yeah. Although the way you are going to die in a hideous environmental collapse, those of you who are younger, the suffering, the pain, the hideous future that is you, that's pretty personal too. I'm,
But we all mutually understand it.
Understood. Agreed upon. Yes, go ahead.
So I guess in terms of that aspect of it, you sort of state, as far as like talking about pornography, like heterosexual.
Yeah.
What do you think the LGBT
Yeah.
like aspect of pornography? Because it's definitely not just like
Yeah.
straight porn accounts.
So I introduced a complex critique of pornography in 10 minutes, so couldn't do justice to everything. And I meant to say that the critique I was offering, rooted in the work of people like Andrea Dworkin, was primarily a critique of what we would call the heterosexual pornography world, which is the overwhelming majority of pornography in the world, and it's the pornography that produces the profits that fuel that industry. All right. That pornography depicts primarily heterosexual sex for a primarily heterosexual male audience. There is an incredible range of sexual images in the world, obviously, including a very profitable and thriving gay pornography market and a much smaller lesbian porn market. But the gay male porn market is also extremely profitable. What can we learn from let's say you take the feminist critique of pornography seriously, and some people dispute it, but let's say for the sake of argument, you say, okay, sexualizing men's cruelty toward and domination of women is probably a bad thing. That flooding a culture with literally millions of images of men gaining sexual pleasure through the subordination of women is probably not good. I think we can probably get agreement on that. Okay. People will sometimes say, well, what about all these other images? People have to be free to explore. Sexuality is, can't be contained, all of which is true. But if you look at the gay male porn market, and there isn't a lot of research on it, there's a couple of good books using the feminist analysis to look at gay male porn. What you find is it's the same dynamic, that much of gay male porn also sexualizes domination and subordination. It's just obviously not male over female. They find other ways to. So gay male porn is also incredibly racist, right? It sexualizes racial domination. It sexualizes top and bottom, dominant man and subordinate man, penetrator and penetrated. It has all the same kinds of problems. The straight world is not particularly interested in a critique of pornography. You raise this and people shy away. It's even more difficult to discuss in the gay male community, in my experience. In fact, the best book about this from my point of view, the author of it was so vilified, he was a gay man, he was so vilified in the gay community that he literally moved out of the country. He just said, I don't want to put up with this anymore. He moved to Australia, which turned out to be no better, but that's another story. So I do think there are things to learn from the radical feminist critique of pornography across the board. But I also want to acknowledge it's been the subject of great debate within feminism. Going back to the 1980s, when I first got involved with this, there was already a quite vigorous debate. And I don't want to try to capture it all in one glib comment. But I do think that if you look at the trajectory of the porn industry from where it was in the 70s when Andrea first started analyzing it, I think the radical feminist critique, as I said, provides a good way to understand why we live with what we live with today. And it's ironic that it's a perspective that's been largely ignored. But, we talked about this. There's a critique of capitalism that's very important, yes? And it's largely ignored as well. So, yeah.
These sorts of porns that you're talking about, pornography, I was wondering if this is mostly like a Western thing? Is it most characteristic of Western societies?
So,
Domination of women and domination of people of color.
yeah. So, is pornography primarily a problem of the West?
The particular ones that you're...
Yeah, the domination-subordination dynamic. So let's back up a bit. Patriarchy. I use that term. I defined it as institutionalized male dominance. Nobody stood up and yelled at me. But that's a debate as well. Is patriarchy still an appropriate term to describe the contemporary United States? A number of women are nodding vigorously, some of the men too. Okay. Is patriarchy also a term that could describe non-West? Take Saudi Arabia. Is Saudi Arabia a patriarchal society?
We're talking about Sharia law, then yeah.
Or you're talking about, in other words, are there societies across the world today that are patriarchal? Yes. Do they all look the same?
No.
No. Okay, so in Saudi Arabia, how much pornography production is there?
Very few.
Yeah, virtually zero. Do Saudi men view pornography?
No.
Yes. Yes, they do. They do. In other words, there's a kind of globalizing of the pornography industry. It's not produced everywhere, but it is consumed everywhere. That was true before the internet, but it's now undoubtedly true. When I've been overseas, I've given lectures on pornography in Pakistan and had a lot of young men nodding along, yeah, okay, you're right about that. In other words, like many other aspects of modern life, there is a kind of globalization of it. And to the best of my knowledge, there will be individual differences from country to country, but the pattern of porn use is roughly the same everywhere. The production was first in Europe, later in the United States. It's now been outsourced a bit. Like a lot of other things, you'll find that pornography production in the third world, in the global south, for a long time Brazil was a big producer. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a flood of pornography production as well as other kinds of sex trade in Eastern Europe, the former communist countries, which had suppressed that kind of stuff, but in a modern, capitalist Eastern Europe, there was a flood of production over there. So basically, borders don't mean much. And of course, when you start thinking about the larger context for pornography, what I would call the sexual exploitation industries, not only pornography, but prostitution and stripping, that's not only globalized in the sense we're talking about, but the trafficking of women and children, both within societies and across international boundaries, is also a serious part of this. So in some sense, we're all one big happy pornographic world at this point, unfortunately. Yeah? This is a weird one. Like all the other ones have been normal. We've just been having a kind of normal chat, but now it's going to get weird. Yeah.
Things that are kind of just glaringly obvious in what they are. I wondered if in any of your research that you've come across any evidence that if we were to remove those aspects from our society, that sexual violence would increase.
Yeah.
Or if it's actually contributed to a somewhat lowering of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, they're not strip clubs, they're gentlemen's clubs. Yes, we want to use the appropriate euphemisms to make sure. Yeah, okay. So this is a long-standing question and the subject of incredible debate. What is the relationship between the sexual exploitation industries, pornography, prostitution, stripping, and levels of sexual violence, levels of rape? There are people on my side of the fence who would argue that there is a clear causal connection between the consumption of pornography and levels of sexual violence. I do not make that claim because I think it's always a complex thing to connect media use to behavior, right? And we should be careful. I tend to be fairly cautious in making claims like that. But there's another set of questions about violence and the sexual exploitation industries that involve the women in the industries. So before we ask what's the relationship between these industries and levels of rape in the culture, we should realize they thrive on a form of sexual violence. That doesn't mean every woman in pornography is being raped every day. It means that that kind of violence is so woven into the fabric of the industry that it's hard to tease apart. And this is especially true when you look at the reality of women in prostitution. Right? And a lot of women who have been in prostitution and survived and come out will describe being prostituted as essentially being raped every day. It may not meet the legal definition of sexual assault under the law, but the experience of women is very much like that. So one answer to that is, before we get into the connection between these industries and what happens out here, let's make sure we think about what happens in there as well. My own view is that it's a kind of question that really can't be answered. That part of the reason it can't be answered is because we don't know how much rape there is in the culture right now. We have no way of actually, with any kind of clarity, assessing the levels of sexual violence. Because what is seen as sexual violence varies. There are many studies that demonstrate that women who have experienced something that meets the legal definition of rape often do not think of themselves as having been raped. There are studies that show that men who self-report, in other words, men describing their own behavior, describe acts that meet the legal definition of rape, who are adamant they have never raped. In other words, we're not talking about something that has a clear, objective definition that you can go out and collect data on and then know that X% of women in the culture have been the victim of sexual violence. Right? It's the subjective understanding of what that means that complicates an already difficult data gathering task. Now, it seems to me inevitable that the way we're socialized to think about sex is going to have an effect on that subjective decision. So if you're raised from a very early age in a pornography-saturated world on images that depict men gaining sexual pleasure from humiliating and degrading women, in a context where the women seem to, on the film, enjoy it, it's going to affect your concept of what violence is. And so how much of the violence that happens in everyday life is a product of people being so desensitized to what truly consensual sex would look like that they can't define? And this is not, just theoretical. I think many people in the room could think about and reflect on experiences that make this real. And I don't want to, it's not appropriate to share all of that here. But I think we all can, whether we're male or female, if we're being honest, can reflect on that. And I think that's one of the reasons it's so hard to talk about pornography, is because, it is personal in a sense that it forces us to critically self-reflect about aspects of our own life that are often incredibly painful. They're painful for women, obviously, and men who've been assaulted. That's not hard to understand. They're also, and I don't want to seem to be apologizing for men, but they're also painful, because I've gone through this, where when you're forced to critically self-reflect about how you've been socialized as a man, it's incredibly distressing if you take it seriously, because you realize much of the way you thought you were being a good guy was not so good after all. Right? All of this is incredibly difficult for everybody. Right? The only thing you can do is try and be honest about it and find support, but it's hard. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Yeah, okay. I'll address that, but did you want to? Yeah. Yeah. So, in Nevada. So, let me just respond real quickly, because this is a complex debate within feminism, and I'm on one side, other people are on the other. I'm right, they're wrong, they're stupid, but I'm going to give them the, no, I'm kidding, that's a joke. I get, you're not picking up on this obligatory chuckle thing, but that's okay. All right, so you can see it even in the terms. I consistently referred to prostitution, women who are prostituted. I do not, and people I learn from never use the term sex work, because that implies that being prostituted is the equivalent of, working in McDonald's or something. And I don't believe that to be true. I think there is something about the nature of intimacy and sexuality that when you reduce it to work, everybody loses, okay? So that's a conceptual question. The kind of empirical question about what really happens in the world, there's also debate on. So there are people who identify as sex workers who claim it's empowering and a true choice. I think if you look at the research and the data and listen to women, especially women who've come out of prostitution, that argument falls apart really quickly. And there's now a big push to legalize or decriminalize sex work, and often people who identify as sex workers are at the forefront of that. But it's important to look closely at who those people are. Some of them are not really working as prostitutes. They are brothel owners and pimps. There's an English journalist named Julie Bindel who's written an extraordinary book, came out last year, called The Pimping of Prostitution. And she details how a lot of the political energy to decriminalize or legalize prostitution isn't coming from women working the streets. It's coming from people who claim this title sex work but really are the ones profiting from it. There's a third choice between criminalizing, that is making prostitution illegal, and decriminalizing or making it legal. It's what's called the Nordic model because it was first tried in Sweden. And that has an interesting perspective. It says, we are going to decriminalize the act of selling sex, which is primarily done by women, although also by men in some contexts. If you are selling sex, you will not be charged. But if you are buying sex, you will continue to face criminal penalties. In other words, it puts a responsibility on the primarily male customers and takes the responsibility off of the women. Right? It also, the Nordic model argues for an increase in funding for what are called exit services for women who want to get out of prostitution. Because all of the research is quite clear that the vast majority of women who work in prostitution, if they had adequate income, childcare, health care, all the things that might keep them in that world, that the vast majority would leave prostitution tomorrow if they could live without that income. Right? And so providing exit services is very important. The Nordic model is spreading. There are more and more countries. The last one I was just reading about is Israel is instituting it. So there's a debate within feminism about this. There are three models. The feminists I learned from, come out of, and still ally with, support the Nordic model. But you'll find a vigorous debate about this in women's studies. And in fact, just to be clear, the position I'm articulating is the minority position. Right? If you go into a typical women's studies class at the University of Texas, where I'm from, you would find that the argument I'm making would not be the majority position. So if you go out and read about it, you can be aware of that. I just realized we've kept you treed here for more than an hour and a half. So let's take any last comments, questions, and then I can hang around and chat, but I don't want to keep people imprisoned for too long.
Well, this is in regards to what we were just talking
Yeah.
about. But I was wondering if in a country like Germany, if because prostitution is legal,
Yes.
I wonder if they experience less sexual crime rates because of something like that.
You will find people arguing about just the data. Right? People can't even agree on the facts. But the research that I have seen and the accounts that I trust suggest that legalizing or decriminalizing prostitution does not reduce sexual violence in general. It does not make the working lives of women being prostituted safer, and it increases sex trafficking because it increases demand. And when you increase demand and the ability to make money, that means that women are not safe.
But in these places where it's legal, is it also regulated?
Yeah, it's regulated, although it's regulated like lots of things are regulated. Like food quality is regulated. And when, in fact, there's no incentive on the part of people in charge to actually regulate. So yes, we're talking about two different camps, really. One is called the abolitionist camp, and the other is called the harm reduction camp. I come out of the abolitionist camp. I do not think a decent human society is consistent with buying and selling people for sex. Okay? The harm reduction camp says there might be problems in the way this works out, but the more feasible project is to reduce harm, which means things like decriminalization, regulation, unions for so-called sex workers, all that kind of thing. And again, I don't want to suggest that either you agree with me or you're an idiot. I really was kidding about that. There are legitimate debates that go on, but I think after 30 years of paying attention to this, for me, the weight of the evidence grows every year for an abolitionist model, for the Nordic model, for the feminist critique of pornography. Yeah. All right, before we go, I just want to identify where the sign-up sheet for Roy's class is. If you are in Roy's class and you want the extra credit, make sure your name is on that, and are you going to take responsibility for getting it to Roy? I don't have to run, so I'm here. You can take a look at the books. We can talk about other things. Last point is, hey, thanks. This was fun in a strange kind of way.